At a family dinner, a relative pulled me aside to tell me how lucky I am to have such a supportive older sister. I haven't spoken to my sister more than twice in 2 years. Part 1. The foundation I built with my own hands. My name is Claire Whitfield, and I'm 34 years old. 2 years ago, I was sitting on the floor of a nearly empty apartment in Columbus, Ohio, eating takeout pad thai directly from the container, crying so hard I couldn't see the fork. My divorce had just been finalized, my savings were split in a settlement that still made my stomach turn, my credit had taken damage from joint accounts my ex-husband had quietly run up without telling me, and I had exactly one piece of furniture, a mattress I'd bought at a discount outlet the week before, to my name. That was the lowest point of my adult life. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what happened, because context matters enormously here. During my marriage to Derek, I had supported us for 2.5 years while he finished his MBA. I worked 60-hour weeks as a project manager at a healthcare software company, paid our rent, paid our groceries, managed our bills, and quietly shelved my own ambition to go back to school because we couldn't afford 2 tuitions at once. When Derek graduated, got an excellent job, and then, 8 months later, told me he had grown in a different direction, which turned out to mean he had grown toward a 27-year-old in his office, I was left holding a life I had largely constructed alone, now dismantled by someone else's choices. I received minimal settlement support because Derek's attorney was better than mine and because, in the eyes of the court, we hadn't been married long enough to trigger significant asset protection for me. I walked away with enough money to cover 4 months of rent somewhere modest, my car, and my professional wardrobe. That was it. So I rebuilt. Not with help. Not with family money or loans from relatives or anyone swooping in to rescue me. I rebuilt with spreadsheets. I want you to understand how methodical this was, because the methodical nature of it is the whole point of everything that comes later. I created a budget document so detailed it had 17 tabs. I tracked every dollar. I took on freelance consulting work on weekends. I applied for a modest promotion at my company and got it, partly because I had nothing else to focus on. I stopped eating out except for special occasions. I researched first-time homebuyer programs in Ohio for months. I built my credit back up over 18 months with obsessive, deliberate care, paying everything 2 weeks early, keeping utilization under 15%, disputing 2 errors on my report that I found by reviewing every single line. By January of last year, I had saved enough for a down payment on a small 2-bedroom condo in a neighborhood called Clintonville, walkable, charming, with a coffee shop I loved 3 blocks away. The mortgage payment was $112 less per month than I'd been paying in rent. The building had a rooftop deck. The unit had original hardwood floors and a kitchen with actual counter space. I closed on that property on a Tuesday afternoon in February. My real estate agent, a wonderful woman named Priya, shook my hand and said, "You did something really hard. Be proud of yourself." I sat in my car in the parking lot of the title company and called my mother and cried, but these were different tears, the kind that feel like release rather than loss. My older sister Rebecca was not there. She had not helped me research neighborhoods. She had not co-signed anything, lent me money, connected me to a lender, reviewed my paperwork, or provided emotional support during any of the 18 months of grinding, disciplined rebuilding. Rebecca is 39, lives in Cincinnati with her husband Tom and their 2 kids, and has a comfortable, settled life. She is the kind of person who sends birthday cards 3 weeks late and then feels good about having sent them at all. Rebecca had called me twice during my entire divorce and rebuilding period. Once to ask if I was hanging in there, and once to tell me about a podcast she thought I might like about healing from heartbreak. I thanked her for the recommendation, didn't listen to the podcast, and went back to my spreadsheets. We have never been particularly close. There's no dramatic falling out in our history. We're just different people who happen to share parents. We see each other at Thanksgiving and Christmas, exchange polite texts about major life events, and maintain the kind of surface-level relationship that functional but distant sisters maintain in adulthood. I told her about the condo purchase in a group family text. She responded with a champagne bottle emoji and, "So proud of you." I remember thinking the exclamation points felt slightly excessive given the minimal role she had played in any of it. But I let it go. People celebrate things in their own ways. I didn't know then what she was doing with my story in the months that followed. Part 2. The dinner where everything shifted. The family dinner happened in late October. My parents host Thanksgiving and Christmas, but they also do what my mother calls a fall gathering every October. A casual but well-attended dinner party that includes my parents, my aunt and uncle from Dayton, 2 sets of family friends who have known us since Rebecca and I were in elementary school, and occasionally their adult children. It's a warm, slightly chaotic event with too much food, a fireplace, and the inevitable family slideshow my dad insists on running on the television even though no one has ever, in 15 years, asked for it. I arrived late, traffic from Columbus was bad, and when I walked in, I was immediately pulled into a hug by my Aunt Diane, who held me by both arms afterward and looked at me with that particular expression adults reserve for people who have survived something. "Claire, honey," she said, "I have to tell you, I think what Rebecca did for you is just beautiful. You're so lucky to have her." I smiled. I assumed this was about something I wasn't aware of. Maybe Rebecca had sent Diane some information on my behalf about something. Maybe there was context I was missing. "That's sweet," I said, because it seemed like the safest response. I got a drink and found my mother in the kitchen. "What did Rebecca do for Diane?" I asked. My mother looked slightly uncomfortable. "She's been telling people about helping you get the apartment. I think she's mentioned it to a few people." "Helping me," I repeated. "She's proud of you. You know how Rebecca is. She expresses things a certain way." I did not pursue it further in that moment because my mother's expression was asking me not to, and because I am, by nature, someone who gathers information before I act on it. I gathered a great deal of information over the next 2 hours. Gary and Patricia Hollenbeck, family friends since I was 8 years old, told me they had heard such a wonderful story about how Rebecca had spotted the condo for me and really been there during a hard time. My Uncle Richard made a toast at dinner that included a line about how family shows up when it counts, and glanced at Rebecca when he said it in a way that was unmistakable. My own mother's friend Sandra pulled me aside near the dessert table to say she'd heard that Rebecca had helped me get my finances in order after the divorce. I had not spoken about the condo, the divorce, or my finances to any of these people directly. The story they had was not mine. It had been authored by someone else and distributed, to family friends, to my aunt and uncle, as a portrait of sisterly generosity that had, apparently, been the talk of several conversations I was not present for. By the time dinner was wrapping up, I had a very clear picture of what had happened. Rebecca had taken my story, my 18 months of isolated, exhausting, methodical rebuilding, and retold it with herself in the starring role. She had cast herself as the steady older sister who guided me through the darkness, who spotted the opportunity, who helped me get back on my feet. My actual experience had been compressed into a backdrop for her performance of a role she had never played. I found her in the living room, laughing with Patricia, and I asked if I could talk to her for a minute. She followed me to the small hallway near the coat closet with the pleasant, slightly indulgent expression of someone who expects to be thanked. "I've been hearing about how you helped me buy my apartment," I said. "Oh." She smiled. "I've just been telling people about what you went through, how you came out the other side. I'm proud of you." "They don't think you're telling my story," I said, keeping my voice even. "They think you're telling your story. About how you helped me." She looked genuinely puzzled, and this is the part that has stayed with me, the part I've returned to 100 times since. She was not faking the confusion. She truly could not locate the problem. "I mean, you're my sister," she said. "We're family. Your story is part of my story." "You weren't there, Rebecca. You called me twice in 18 months. You didn't help me. You didn't give me money, you didn't help me research anything, you didn't co-sign anything. There was no help." "I was supportive," she said, a slight edge entering her voice. "I'm always supportive. 2 phone calls is not support." "I don't think this is a big deal, Claire. I'm not trying to hurt you, I'm trying to celebrate you. Why are you making this into something?" And there it was, the subtle but unmistakable pivot. My objection to having my story taken was being reframed as the problem. Not the taking. My noticing. I looked at my sister for a long moment. She was genuinely baffled. She had done something that felt to her like generosity, sharing a feel-good story, reflecting pride in her sister, and she could not understand why I was standing in the coat closet hallway treating it like a crime. I made a decision in that moment. Not to escalate. Not to cry or yell or accuse her in front of our family, because none of that would accomplish anything except making me look like the unstable divorced woman having a meltdown over nothing. I decided to do what I have learned to do in the past 2 years with every problem that matters. I decided to be methodical. "Let's leave it for tonight," I said. "I just wanted you to know that I heard what people were saying." Rebecca nodded, looking relieved. She probably thought that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. Part 3. The planning phase. I drove home to Columbus that night with the radio off, thinking. Here is what I understood about the situation. Rebecca had not done anything illegal. She had not forged documents or stolen money. She had told a flattering story about herself that happened to require erasing me. In a court of law, this is not a crime. In the court of public opinion, specifically, the small and interconnected public of our extended family and family friends, it was something else entirely. The question was not whether to respond. I knew I would respond. The question was how, and in what form, and to what end. I have a friend named Jess who works in communications and who has an almost forensic understanding of how narratives function. I called her the next morning and described the situation in full, including the specific things various people had said and the geography of who had heard what. "She's built a reputation on your story," Jess said, when I finished. "And she's probably been telling it for months. The longer it sits, the more entrenched it gets." "Which means correcting it gets harder with time," I said. "Which means correcting it now, while it's still relatively recent, is the right call. But how you correct it matters as much as the correction itself. If you go in angry, you become the villain. If you go in like you're just genuinely sharing your experience, you take back the narrative without making it a conflict." We talked for 2 hours. By the end of that call, I had a clear plan. It was not a plan based on confrontation. It was a plan based on presence, specifically, on reclaiming the space in which my story lived by telling it myself, clearly, directly, and completely, to every person who had heard Rebecca's version. Step 1. Documentation. I pulled together everything that proved the story was mine. Mortgage closing documents. The communications with my real estate agent. The budget spreadsheets with timestamps going back to the month of my divorce finalization. My promotion letter. My credit monitoring history. I was not going to wave these documents in anyone's face. I simply wanted to have them, to feel the weight of the evidence that my experience had been real and mine and unassisted. Step 2. An honest conversation with my parents. Not to complain about Rebecca. To tell them my story, the real version, and to do it in a way that was specific and detailed enough that my mother, who loved us both and was caught in the middle, would have the full picture. Step 3. Individual outreach to each of the people who had been told Rebecca's version. Not a mass email, not a group text, not a dramatic announcement. Personal, individual conversations in which I thanked them for their warmth and then, naturally, told them what the experience had actually been like for me. Step 4. One more conversation with Rebecca. After everything else. When she had the chance to see what her story looked like in a room where my story had already been told. I gave myself a timeline. 6 weeks. Long enough to be careful, short enough that the story didn't calcify further. I started that week. Update 1. The conversation with my parents. I drove to my parents' house the following Saturday and asked if I could talk to them after lunch. We sat in the living room, my father in his armchair, my mother on the couch, me across from them, and I told them everything. I told them about the spreadsheets. About the 18 months of budget discipline that I had never described to them in detail because I hadn't wanted to worry them. I told them about the credit rebuilding, the weekend consulting work, the promotion. I pulled up the closing document on my phone and showed them the date and the purchase price and my name, singular, on the deed. I was not angry when I told this story. I was calm and specific. "I didn't know it was this hard," my mother said quietly. "I didn't want anyone to know," I said. "I needed to do it myself. That was important to me." My father, who is a quiet man and a fair one, said, "And you did do it yourself?" "Yes," I said. "And your sister has been telling people something different. She's been telling people something that makes her a part of a story she wasn't part of. I don't think she's doing it to hurt me. But it's not true, and people believe it, and I wanted you to know the real version." There was a long silence. My mother's discomfort was palpable. She loves both of us, and she finds conflict between us painful. But she also looked, in that moment, like someone who was recalibrating. Like someone who was taking my experience seriously for perhaps the first time since the divorce. "I should have been more present," she said. "During all of that." "I didn't ask you to be," I said. "I'm not blaming anyone. I'm just telling you my story." My father said he would talk to Rebecca. I asked him to wait, to let me handle it in my own way and time. He agreed, though I could see it cost him something to hold back. I drove home feeling something I hadn't expected, not vindicated, but seen. For the first time since the divorce, someone in my family had heard what the past 2 years had actually been like for me. That mattered more than I had anticipated. Update 2. Reclaiming the narrative. Over the next 3 weeks, I reached out individually to Aunt Diane, to Gary and Patricia Hollenbeck, to my Uncle Richard, and to Sandra. I didn't call them to make a complaint. I called them to catch up, genuinely, warmly, and when they inevitably asked about the apartment, I told them my actual story. The same story I told my parents. Specific. Detailed. First person. 18 months long. Aunt Diane was the most interesting conversation. She's a sharp woman who has always liked me, and about 5 minutes into my description of the credit rebuilding process, I watched her expression shift. "Rebecca never mentioned any of this," she said slowly. "No," I said. "It wasn't really her experience to describe. Diane said nothing for a moment. Then, I see. Those 2 words carried more than their surface weight. She was doing the math. She was comparing the story she'd been told with the story she was now hearing, and she was understanding the gap between them. Gary Hollenbeck called me back 2 days after our conversation to ask if I might consider speaking at a women's financial recovery event that a friend of his was organizing. He works in nonprofit development, and apparently a story like mine, divorce, financial reset, credit rebuilding, property ownership, was exactly what the event's founder was looking for. I said yes. I began drafting notes. By the time I finished my individual outreach, I had spoken to every person who had attended that October dinner. The story they now held was mine. Not a correction, exactly. I never said, Rebecca didn't actually help me. I simply occupied the story so completely with the truth that the fiction had nowhere to stand. Update 3. The community becomes witness. The financial recovery event was held on a Thursday evening at a community center in Dublin, a suburb north of Columbus. 53 people attended. I spoke for 20 minutes about rebuilding financial stability after divorce, and I was specific, embarrassingly specific by some standards. I talked about the 17-tab spreadsheet. I talked about keeping utilization under 15%. I talked about what it felt like to close on property with my name alone on the deed. People responded in a way I had not anticipated. Women came up to me afterward and said things like, I thought I was the only one who made spreadsheets like that, and, my divorce was 3 years ago and I've been too scared to look at my credit score. I exchanged contact information with several of them. A local journalist who was there as an attendee asked if I'd be willing to be interviewed for a piece about post-divorce financial recovery for a Columbus lifestyle magazine. I said yes to that too. When the article came out 6 weeks later, it included my name, my neighborhood, a photograph of me standing on my rooftop deck, and a detailed account of how I had rebuilt my financial life alone over 18 months. My Aunt Diane sent it to the family group chat with the words, "So proud of Claire. What an incredible journey." I don't know who else in the family shared it, but I know everyone who had attended that October dinner received it. I also know, because my mother called me, that Rebecca called my mother the day the article was published. My mother said she was very quiet on the phone. Update 4. The second conversation with Rebecca. Rebecca called me on a Sunday afternoon in December, 3 weeks after the article ran. I was making coffee. I let it ring once, took a breath, and answered. I read the article, she said. I figured you had. You didn't mention me in it. No, I said. There wasn't anything to mention. A long pause. Then, I think I made you sound a certain way when I was telling people about you. Like you had more support than you did. It was as close to an acknowledgement as I expected to get. I had not expected it to feel as small as it did. Not the acknowledgement itself, but the entire conversation, which was so much smaller than the 18 months it concerned. You told your version of a story that wasn't yours, I said. I don't think you did it to hurt me. But it did something real to how people understood what I went through. It made my experience look like something you were part of. And you weren't. I know, she said, and her voice was tight in the way that voices get when someone is holding back something complicated. I think I wanted to be. Part of it, I mean. I think I felt guilty that I hadn't been more present, and it was easier to, I don't know, to insert myself in retrospect. This surprised me. It was more self-aware than I had credited her with being. That's honest, I said. I'm sorry, she said. It was not an elaborate apology. It was 3 words delivered plainly, and I think that was all she had. I appreciate that, I said. We talked for another 10 minutes about nothing important. Her kids, the holidays, whether the fall gathering would happen again next year. The conversation was not warm, but it was civil. It was the conversation of 2 adults who had arrived at a new understanding of where the lines were. When I hung up, I stood in my kitchen for a moment on my hardwood floors, in the apartment that had my name on the deed, and I felt something that I can only describe as clean. Not happy, exactly. Not victorious. Clean. Resolution. What the 18 months were actually about. The Columbus lifestyle piece generated more than I expected. A financial literacy nonprofit in Central Ohio reached out and asked if I would be a periodic speaker at their workshops for women navigating divorce and financial recovery. I said yes. I have now spoken at 4 of their events. I am developing a short workshop module on credit rebuilding that they plan to incorporate into their curriculum. I am 34 years old. I own a 2-bedroom condo with original hardwood floors in a neighborhood where I know my neighbors. My credit score is 41 points higher than it was at my lowest point. I have an emergency fund and a retirement account and a budget document that now has 19 tabs. Here is what I want to say about my sister Rebecca, because I've thought about it enough to have an opinion that isn't soaked in anger. She is not a villain. She is a person who looked at something bright and wanted to stand in its light. She had spent years as the settled older sister with the house and the husband and the stable life, and then watched her younger sister, the one who had seemed so much less put together, accomplish something genuinely hard entirely alone. I think it threatened something in her understanding of the sibling dynamic. And rather than sit with that discomfort, she managed it by making herself part of the story. That is not a good thing to do. It erased a real experience. It gave other people a false understanding of what I had survived and how. It took credit that was not hers. I will not pretend it didn't hurt, or that the hurt wasn't complicated by the loneliness it reflected, the 18 months in which she hadn't shown up, and then her retroactive appearance in the story as someone who had. But I also understand, now, something I didn't understand at that October dinner. The most powerful response to having your story taken is not to demand it back loudly. It is to tell it yourself, clearly, with all the detail that only someone who actually lived it can provide. To fill the space so completely with a truth that the fiction simply has no room. My story is not about revenge. I want to be clear about that. I didn't embarrass Rebecca publicly. I didn't call her out at a family dinner. I didn't write a targeted post about her behavior. I did not, at any point, name her in the article or the speaking events as a cautionary tale. What I did was more specific and more lasting. I told my own story better than she had told her version of it, and I told it to the people who mattered, and I told it with the receipts of lived experience that no one else could replicate. The magazine article sits on my coffee table sometimes when I have people over. Not as a trophy. As a record. As evidence that the 18 months were real, that the spreadsheets were real, that the Tuesday afternoon in the parking lot of the title company was real. My Aunt Diane sends me articles about personal finance now. She texts me occasionally to ask how things are going. She never mentions Rebecca's version of events. My parents, I think, understand something now about the past 2 years that they didn't understand before. My mother has started calling me more regularly. Not to check in, exactly, but just to talk. Last week she asked me to walk her through how I had rebuilt my credit, because she has a friend going through a divorce and wanted to be able to give her useful information. I spent 45 minutes on the phone explaining it. That is what I wanted. Not acknowledgement. Not an apology, though I received a partial one. I wanted my experience to exist accurately in the world, to belong to me in the way that it should, to be understood by the people who knew me as something I had done myself. I bought an apartment after a difficult divorce, on my own, without help. And now everyone knows it. Edit. I want to clarify something people keep asking in the comments. Yes, the article is publicly available, but I'm not going to link it here because this account is already semi-public and I'd like to keep some distance between the Reddit post and my real name. What I will say is that if you're going through something similar, divorce, financial reset, rebuilding from zero, the credit rebuilding process is very achievable and very methodical, and I am happy to walk through the basics if anyone wants to DM me. Second edit. To everyone saying I should have burned her down or exposed her publicly, I want to say gently that I understand the impulse, but that was never the goal. The goal was to make sure my story was true in the places where it mattered. That's done. Rebecca and I are not close, and I don't expect that to change, but we are civil, and that's enough for me. Sometimes the quietest response is the one that lasts.